Just getting on YouTube. I always have to pause for a minute because I'm not sure. It takes a while for it to launch. And that's not like, I'm pretty sure it's recording at this point, but I don't know if it's muted. So I'm waiting for it to launch. Okay, it's muted. And now I can, otherwise I'm going to be hearing myself on tape delay. All right. So we will call to order this special meeting. This actually wasn't a meeting that was on our schedule for some reason. I'm not sure why that is, but this special meeting, the Eastern Reading Region 9 Joint Boards of Education Policy Committee at 9:04 a.m. On April 30th, 2021. The first item we have on the agenda is the approval of minutes from our April 22nd and our April 23rd Board of Education
So moved.
Meetings. Thank you. Do I have a second?
I would second, but you didn't technically have that meeting that I wasn't at. So it's minutes of a non-meeting because there was no quorum. And I believe that was the 22nd, not the 23rd. So I can approve the minutes for the 23rd, but the 22nd really was a non-meeting.
Yep.
I wrote that up in the minutes.
Okay.
But you had no quorum.
Yep. Understood. Okay. So then, and then I think the motion we're looking for is an approval of the minutes for the April 23rd meeting.
Sure. Withdrawn and moved.
Okay. Thank you.
Second.
And seconded by Maureen. Any discussion? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Three yes votes. I think you're abstaining. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was AWOL all last
I'm
week.
present. That's right. Some people have lives they have to live.
Well, I said to somebody, it's like, and then when you start skipping, it's like you realize, like, I could just not go. Maybe I should just start doing that. Then
Wait a second. Tell me more about this.
Anyway.
Tell me more about this option.
Yeah. You just don't show up. It's amazing.
That's very good.
No, I was actually working.
Okay. All right. So that takes us to the next item on the agenda, item number 3, public comment. No members of the public being present at this meeting. We'll move to item 4, the committee member comment. Hearing none. We'll move to item 5, discussion and possible action, review and feedback of governance and process for joint meetings and collaborations of the Eastern Reading Region 9 Boards of Education. Say that 5 times fast. So this brings us back to the work that we had been doing. I asked, just because it's better to have specificity and make sure that people understand sort of what we're talking about. And I think we had a consistent sort of discussion, that sort of generally would be in the CAPE model policies in the 9000 series. But just to make it crystal clear what we're talking about, let's put this on for the next several weeks until we come to the May 25th meeting of the Eastern Reading Region 9 Joint Boards, and see if ideally after that meeting we'll be able to move on and back to our regular policy conversations. What we had done in our last, and I'm just going to share my screen here. In our last sessions, we started a document, which I think is really useful, that where we're just actually taking the each one of the elements from the presentation. So we have our sort of presentation that outlines the sort of main topics that we wanted to touch on, that we worked. It was the April 23rd meeting that for the minutes that we just approved, where we sort of invited all of the other board members to join us and opine, on their concerns, et cetera. And sort of coming out of that meeting, we realized, like, okay, there is specific language that we're sort of ready to draft and then be presenting on May 25th. That language we thought best to catalog in a really sort of logical way. So we created a Google Sheet, and we're cataloging that sample language here. So we made it down to row number 7. I do wonder if it would be useful. So let's just start a little item ID in case we move things around. We can keep track of these, and I'm just going to do a simple number here. Okay. Okay, so item ID 6, meeting governance HR contracts was where we had left off. Unless anyone sees something here that we should, thank you. Anything here that we should go back to? Are we good to?
We ended at a reasonable sort of breaking point last week between this committee recommendation and HR thing. I guess my question is, did we fully bottom out on the acting on committee recommendations question? Because I think particularly something like exigent circumstances is a squishy phrase, possibly on purpose, but to the extent there's sort of guardrails around that, it might be helpful going forward. But what does exigent mean to get out of a tri-board circumstance?
Yep. What do we think? What do we think that means?
Time sensitive.
Okay. Anything else that we would add to that? I mean, is that really it?
I don't know that that's really it, because I can imagine other circumstances that are not necessarily time sensitive, but that someone feels compelled to start a process rather than finish it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, okay, well, we might not do this now, but if we don't make this decision now, are we causing ourselves, I don't know, I'm being squishy, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Are we causing ourselves more problems down the road? So I guess my own problem is how I'm defining time sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
Does a decision need to be made today, or is it just generally time sensitive over the life of a project?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess time sensitive is okay. I take that back.
Because the exigent circumstance time sensitivity is really a carve out from the default rule of when you act in a joint committee recommendation, you act only when sitting jointly. And so it gets to the broader question of what are joint committee recommendations and when would that rise to an exigent circumstance? And I think the example that we had in mind last week, or that I had in mind last week, was amendments to the bus contract to account for COVID adjustments.
Mm-hmm.
I'm struggling to think of other things that would purely fit into that bucket, because I don't want to get into the circumstance where somebody says, well, a senior administrator resigned unexpectedly, so we really need to form a personnel search committee. So we're going to form one because our meeting happens to be tonight. That feels to me like something that should be a joint conversation almost no matter what. And the exigency there is the exigency to hold a tri-board meeting.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I think one of the distinctions here is this is specific to acting on committee recommendations.
That's
right.
Yeah.
So we could say, generally speaking, taking action related to joint committee recommendations should occur within the framework of a joint session.
Would it be helpful or harmful to say, unless the joint committee makes a determination that individual boards can act on that issue? Like in the joint committee recommendation, it is, we recommend that the transportation contract be amended to extend for an additional year. We further recommend that this can be taken up by the three boards individually.
Okay.
Okay.
Like give the joint
You're going to get
committees
pushback on where the power lies there. Does that give too much power to
a little bit?
Yeah, but I think that would be a recommendation that would allow the individual chairs to schedule those items specially as opposed to jointly. But I'm just trying to, like, they don't have power per se, but it's their recommendation. I'm trying to find a carve out that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it also helps to explain the intent. The reason why we think joint committee recommendation should occur within joint sessions is so that there can be discussion on an issue that affects all three boards between the members of all three boards.
Right. Which gets to Mike D'Agostino's point from last week of we want board members to be reporting the work of joint committees to individual boards.
Yep.
But when it comes to acting on things, it's important that that be amongst the 21.
Yeah. So we could say individual representatives. Okay. So first, let's taking action should occur within the framework of a joint session. What's the exception?
You could say unless you could require that the unanimous consent of the joint committee recommends otherwise, or identifies the issue as something that can be handled individually, or we might just be completely overthinking this, and it could just be always joint committees, joint sessions, and leave it there.
I think it does make sense to give, for urgent issues, time sensitive issues,
and minor issues, frankly. There's an
Right.
expedience in really pro forma kind of things that we don't need to hold a special meeting in March so that 21 people can up down a really minor certification issue or something.
So maybe
And I
we start with.
apologize because I missed obviously all of the conversation on this. What is it that we're trying to avoid here? The three boards sort of having discussions about a single issue that are separate and may not lead to the same conclusion, or
We're trying to sort of define the role of joint committees and what the output of those committees are, and the extent to which the output of the joint committees is recommendations to the boards, which require action. The general sense is that that action should only be taken in the context of a joint meeting and not in the context of three individual meetings, because that might lead to three results based on different conversations that would be valuable across all three boards.
okay.
So does that mean then, using this policy work as an example, that the boards would only take action on recommendations for revision when they are assembled jointly?
Yes, unless there's a time sensitive issue.
Right.
So policy readings will no longer occur in single board meetings?
That would be lovely.
I think what will ultimately happen is once we get to the point where we've approved a joint policy manual, which I think is a prerequisite to a lot of this work on the policy side, I would envision first readings occurring at single meetings because they're not taking formal action so much as acknowledging publicly that they're being considered.
Right.
And then when they are moved for full adoption in a second reading, they would be held in joint meetings. And to the extent the policy committee gets into a quarterly meeting cycle just to do the homework, that sort of dovetails with October, January, May also, to the extent that there are policy revisions that should be coming through.
Yeah, that sounds very workable. That like, it sounds like it's a nice sort of middle ground of you can still make progress in your individual meetings, and it's kind of a part of the report out that individual committee members would be making, is to say, like for policy specifically, here's, first reading equals this is the general policy that we're considering, and this is, the way that we're heading, and then second reading and approval would happen within the framework of a joint session.
So that all three boards ultimately adopt the same policy. Otherwise, if they're living in three separate boards, they could be amended three different ways, and we're back to the same problem we had before.
And if they're not, we're doing it with our eyes open, right? We're not doing it sort of accidentally. We're doing it, because I think it's really easy for a conversation to just kind of have a bump and sort of get a little off the rails, and people start wordsmithing, and then now it's, hold on a second, we're looking at
because there's going to be friction. There has one area in which there has been discrepancies is when Region 9 sits down and says, this policy doesn't impact us because it only deals with kindergartners. We don't need to worry about this.
Right.
Or when Easton and Reading sit down and say, this only deals with 17-year-olds. We don't have any 17-year-olds.
Right.
Part of the getting on the same page about that's okay. We will say that the policies only apply to the extent that they are relevant to our districts, and will accept language that is sort of an appendage.
Yeah. Yeah. Issues taking action related to joint board recommendation should occur within the framework of a joint session, with the goal of providing the opportunity for members of each of the three boards to discuss jointly. I'll just keep typing words. I think the regulation is where we would actually talk about the first reading stuff.
Mhm. Because as a practical matter too, the adoption, with respect to policy specifically, the adoption of a policy only really occurs at the second reading anyway. So the board isn't taking action on a recommendation by accepting a first reading. That's a
Correct.
public notice.
Correct.
Step, really.
Correct. Yeah, there was a question, and I couldn't find clear guidance as to whether or not the board needs to even vote that there has been a first reading.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And so regulation. For example, first readings can occur in individual sessions.
I would say with the exception of time sensitive issues, and we should also say, or I'm trying to find a way to say minor that isn't subjective, or you know, I don't want to say technical revisions either. I'm trying to get to the this is something that everybody agrees is non-controversial and just needs to be voted on,
Right.
like pro forma kind of stuff.
Time sensitive and pro forma.
De minimis too.
De minimis, yeah, or having no financial impact, or like some other.
Is pro forma hyphenated, or is it one word, or is it 6 words? I don't know.
It's hyphenated.
All right.
And de minimis is de minimis, 2 words.
This is not is not underlining in red, so it's right. I think I have to hit
Because
like,
Google knows everything.
no, yeah, that's correct. No, it's I think it's because by default it is not.
There's no spell checking going on.
Yeah, it's not spelling check. I have to like go to a tool and say spell check it now, which is really not good for me. So, okay. Good. All right. That's promising. HR contracts. What is our recommendation for HR contracts?
The adoption, renewal, and termination of HR contracts should only occur in a joint meeting. And this would be a procedural change, because I know that typically we have been in the habit of
Doing them separately.
doing them separately, particularly the superintendent contract, which we've sort of extended by a year every year according to the sort of standard practice.
Okay.
But just because it's a deviation from what we've been doing doesn't mean it's wrong.
I'm going to flag it
Mhm.
there. Operational contracts, including health insurance.
I just want to stick on 6 for
Sure.
a second. I'm just to workshop a hypothetical. If one board becomes dissatisfied with the performance of somebody and the other 2 boards are not, then it would be incumbent upon that board to request a special joint meeting to have that conversation, I guess, if
That
they
sounds
want
right.
to terminate a contract or something to that effect, because they're
So-
ultimately joint contracts.
Right. Sorry.
Wind today is blowing open my doors too. Sorry. Like it's happened a bunch of times, but sorry.
So yeah, what does that look like? Let's say that a one board wanted to terminate the contract of the superintendent. they don't have the right to terminate it on behalf of the other two boards.
No.
Do they essentially have the right to say, we're going to go find our own superintendent? I mean, I think they do.
Theoretically.
Yeah. But then that means that the other two boards are saddled with the cost. So I think from a legal standpoint, all of that, like that process could happen. However, we are designing a framework here to say, like, here's how we plan to get along. This is, again, we're not even saying that this is necessarily sort of binding policy that goes in our bylaws, but this is a set of processes and procedures that we are saying, this is our best practice. We're agreeing this is the norm.
Right.
Well, and I think, doesn't that fall into the same category as if we're hiring somebody and two boards like the person and one board doesn't? Like, ultimately, it's not going to work out. If one board is sort of adamantly opposed to the hire, then, you know, technically the other two boards could force it to happen, but that's not going to end up being a terrific situation.
Right.
So if you have that in the reverse, you have to call a joint meeting and it has to get hashed out one way or another. It can't, you know, I mean, because you're right, technically one board could, you know, withdraw or whatever, just like one board could refuse to hire, but that's not going to be a good solution either. You know, this is one of the situations where it just has to get hashed out.
Right. And in the structure, we have sort of the potential for the tyranny of the minority. And to use Easton as an example, because they're the smallest board, you could have personnel situations that are 18-3, that if it's the right 3, force a problem.
Right. That's right.
And I don't know, and we can accept that that is true and just understand that that's the framework, or we can talk about whether that's the appropriate framework.
Well, and I think, you know, for example, taking it to its, you know, ridiculous end, Easton could eject from all cooperation and say, we're hiring our own superintendent and we don't want to work with anybody else from central office. And we've got our 2 schools and we've got our superintendent and we never talk to you again.
Right. The principal of Keller is now our superintendent, and the head custodian is now our director of facilities, and we'll hire an accountant and see you later.
And we're creating a new Google Drive, you know, contract, and we're creating a new contract for, I mean, basically all of the things that happen out of central office. We're doing our own cybersecurity, we're doing our own, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
But you're still paying your share of the central office lease for as long as that exists, because you're the signatory.
We signed it, right? Because we signed the contract. Yep. Yeah. So let's be clear, that's a bad idea, but
does anyone at home think we're thinking about that?
This is not a proposal. Yeah. This
Before
is just
anybody clips the
understanding
video
the
and says John wants to get out of the system.
Not the intent. Okay. All right. So it's really good to understand that. So I think what this says actually captures everything that we're talking about here. And that's simply saying these conversations have to happen inside of a joint meeting.
And I think maybe you put into a comment or a regulation that to the extent a personnel concern is raised about anybody with whom the board's contract, that board needs to request a joint meeting, which should not be unreasonably withheld or what, you know.
So anyone with
and this also sort of touches on the third rail of who does this cover?
Right. And I can't see what I'm typing because the video box is on top of it. Anyone with a central office contract, the prescribed okay. Okay. Just gonna.
Like I was now asking you whether you're trying to spell check.
Yeah, let's see. Can I go ahead? Huh? Yikes. No, no, not personal. Stop. Wow, it's pretty bad. Two ends? Was that my problem? I don't know. We'll do it later. Operational contracts, including health insurance. So what? The buses, food services, health insurance.
So this is contracts that bind the three boards jointly.
Mm-hmm.
Should only be adopted or canceled jointly. But I want to be careful here because there are some sort of operational contracts that are administrative prerogatives. And we need to sort of decide or understand what the line is between contracts that require board action, bus contract, food service contract, etc., and contracts that historically or legally don't require that board action. We're hiring a firm to handle GoGuardian or security in the buildings or whatever. I don't want to get in the business of adopting every single contract.
Yeah.
I can think of a number of vendors where we have a contract that is, it's to our benefit to have sort of a joint ER9 contract, but it could be a software vendor. It could be something
if we
that really
purchase
would not
paper
require
for all
board
5
debate.
schools in a single contract and then allocate it on the backside. I don't want to be in the business of calling a special joint meeting so that we can approve the purchase of a bunch of paper.
How do you
Would it
define
be-
that?
Would it be right to say something like contracts in which each of the three boards are signatories? Something like that? So this is like,
I mean, technically the boards are signatories on a lot of things, but they're signed by the designee, which is the superintendent.
so what is the way for us to say the contracts that, the board, basically the board chair sign?
I mean, you could put a financial threshold.
Yeah.
Contracts that bind the boards, for a period of at least a year and for an aggregate sum of at least, I don't know what the right number is.
So what about those, and I think this is something we've been scratching at for a while. What about those ongoing contracts that is sort of auto renew?
The evergreen stuff that I think we want to get away from.
Exactly. Where we want to have some oversight about those things.
I mean, I think that there is benefit to looking at contracts in a tiered fashion operationally and saying, here's contracts we need to take action on. And here's contracts that we expect the administration to report on, to say, hey, just so you know, we have entered into these 15 contracts that are in excess of $25,000, whatever the monetary threshold is, from a sort of transparency and governance perspective, so that you're aware of what's going on, but you don't need to act on it. But I might just be creating more headaches.
I think this is really a question that Stephanie ought to answer, because, what would we do that would make life harder for them versus easier?
Yeah, so I'm trying to mull over in my head all of the contracts that might fall into this category. I mean, there are just simply so many contracts. So the big contracts, Power School, and then there are many smaller ones, but I think there's things that are really critical to our operations where it might be a problem if we had to convene a joint board meeting in order to approve the renewal of a contract, especially when that renewal comes up at sort of an odd time.
Like the lease for the copier or a maintenance contract. Like there's so many of these.
Right. So if the lease for the copier is the central office copier, does that mean that all three boards have to approve it?
That's why I've started thinking about it in the same framework as sort of the transfer rule of above a certain threshold, the board needs to act affirmatively. Below a certain threshold, there's just a report out obligation. And does that framework work? Or should we just be talking about setting a dollar threshold or a number of years threshold or a subject matter threshold? And
I think the subject matter threshold might be something to think about. There's a difference between operational contracts and contracts connected to student learning, for example. We don't want to weigh in on whether or not PowerSchool is renewed and at what point. We don't. It's necessary. We kind of think it's necessary. We might want to be reported to, but we don't want to weigh in on how you negotiate with that or any other software. Well, maybe not any. I don't know.
Right, but this is where you get into what's operational and
right.
I mean, so the central office personnel, I mean, clearly that has a whole different process attached to it. Software is really operational, but then how do you characterize transportation?
Right. And
it is operational.
Right.
It's not really in the category of student learning, but it is also a joint board discussion and decision.
Right. It's a multi-year, multi-million-dollar commitment.
So that's where you get into perhaps the dollar threshold.
Right.
But you could have definitely the copier could be on a 3-year lease. So multi-year, yes. Multi-million, no. I mean, I hope. This better be a good
Those
copier.
copier leases have gone up as people have used less paper, though. They've gone crazy.
And the food service question, I'm not sure would meet the multi-year, multi-million threshold.
Yeah.
And it depends how you're characterizing that,
But then,
gross revenue, net revenue, yeah.
And yet it's a particularly sensitive issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so it invites and requires, and probably rightly so, board sort of involvement.
Right. This is sort of exposing that we've gotten into the habit of bringing certain things to the board out of habit, or one time this happened, and so it kept happening. But does it always need to be happening?
Right.
So in the case of transportation and food service, then there's a whole separate committee that addresses those topics and would be a part of, any type of review or recommendation. And then I think it's just a question of, so those typically come back to the joint boards, as opposed to when we're talking about PowerSchool or something of that nature, that has really been the prerogative of the administration. And then certainly that's a part of our budget process, which then comes to the boards.
But I wonder, without knowing, whether the existence of the transportation committee is because at some point 15 years ago, somebody was upset with the vendor. So we created a committee, and then the committee decided that they wanted to go out and bid a new contract. And then they just kept doing that. And in the past, it wasn't the case. And so if tomorrow somebody wakes up and is upset with PowerSchool, it's let's form a committee about, whatever you want to call, learning management platforms. And then suddenly the board is involved in that forever too. I'm just wondering how much of this is just because that's how we've always done it versus having a specific purpose.
Which honestly would be a concern. So that would be in direct contradiction to everything, all of the work that you've been talking about to make things more efficient.
Right. I'm just trying to understand the why we do things, how we do them.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would say, on the other side of it is there are things that the public wants to have better transparency around. And the promise of transparency is one thing, sort of the delivery of that by way of there's a committee that has to have public sessions when they talk about these things. And, based on the way that we've all done things, is going to allow for public comment and, all of that. Whereas when some of these things happen inside of just sort of central office, there's a lot less visibility that is required. And it's only through the good graces of central office personnel who say it is a priority for us to do this, that it happens. But that means we have to magically make sure that forever forward, we have people who are going to go out to the community and sort of make a point of saying, we know, sort of questions about food matter to our parents and our community. And so we're going to sort of socialize this with you. You get the wrong person hired in, you can't always guarantee you have the right people hired in who says, I don't care about getting their input. We're going to do what we feel like doing. So, it's a little bit of that, right? There's this sort of sensitivity of the topic,
or when something comes up like the Power School privacy issue that we've touched on a little bit, and that Stephanie and I had actually chatted about a couple of weeks ago when I never even followed up on that because I got so busy. Where how does something like that is part of, if somebody has a concern about that and then that's getting renewed, is that an appropriate time to discuss it? What's the forum for that?
I know this sounds like we have this kind of impossible, sort of totally qualitative sort of, assessment that we're doing here, where it's just going to be based on some, subjective word that we're going to put in. I think we could work through this, but it's tricky. I think we could come up with the, here are the 10 levers and 3 dials that help us to zero in on whether or not it's appropriate. And there may be things that we're not talking about inside of a committee, where there maybe isn't a committee to talk about this that we should be. And maybe there are things that are being discussed inside of committees that shouldn't be. Yeah.
This sort of, here's a list of 5 things. If the subject matter checks off 3 of them, then it, qualifies for review.
Exactly.
Or something.
That's what I was trying to start sort of doing here. Multi-year, multi-million, sensitive. What does that mean? But I think we can,
issue of public concern issue.
Right.
So this sort of gets back, and this is not to try to sidetrack it, but to a comment I made, I think in the before times at a joint meeting, about whether or not we should be looking at condensing the joint committees into sort of an operations committee, a personnel committee, and basically you'd have the director of finance and operations would work with the operations committee on any of these things, whether they be food service or transportation or contracting or whatever, so that they could rise and fall as the different issues are necessary, as opposed to having a transportation committee that only meets triennially when there's a contracting issue.
That's super interesting. I really like the idea of that, because then you can use the sort of that committee also to and sort of regular public meetings of that committee to say, here are the 15 things that we're doing. And it may have been the last time we met, there were those same 15 things, and we cared about items 1, 2, and 7. But now when we're meeting, our sensitivities have changed. We also care about item number 10 and 12. And then that sort of bubbles that up and sort of helps to answer the question of, is this an issue of public concern?
Right. Because the
I
question
really
is,
like that idea too, but I do think you're going to get, because that's such a change of norm.
Yeah,
right?
agreed.
It's a big change of norm.
Yep.
You're really going to have to explain in great detail why that's a good way to go.
And
But initially, it seems really appealing.
Yeah, I think it's separate from this policy work. I think it's a sort of completely separate conversation that is about, hey, here's an idea for how we could do these sort of operationally aligned committees more efficiently, and actually do a better job of tying into those issues of public concern.
Could you also combine the idea of the thresholds with the broader categories? Because you can imagine then that the operations committee could involve a whole lot of things that are not typically discussed by the board. And then my only sort of question about sort of an issue of public concern, there are a lot of things that members of the public might feel are issues of public concern. to the point that was made earlier in this meeting, but they're really more personal opinions and not
Yeah.
necessarily true matters of public concern. Right?
Well, but and I think that's somewhat subjective, but it's also a matter of, there are some times when it's not a matter of public concern, but it should be. And, you know, as the guy who's been banging the drum on topics of cybersecurity and, you know, all of that for some time, you know, we got into a number of conversations inside of this committee about not Power School, about Go Guardian.
Guardian.
That right,
Yeah.
like there was stuff there, and nobody raised it. So, like yeah.
Go Guardian, My School Bucks is another one where with the fees and things, we had a side conversation on. And
exactly. And it's, yeah, I think that's exactly right. So it's like some of these things, simply because they haven't been discussed or aren't normally discussed, doesn't mean that they shouldn't be. I would also say you know, what is an issue of public concern changes over time. And we're living in a world, you know, we're in 2021 where we're only 20 years from, you know, the time where people really started to consistently have personal computers at home, right? And access to the internet and things like that. So, you know, the idea that, you know, we developed a sensitivity to and have decided that an issue of public concern is food services, that's because we've all been eating for years and years. But we are the parents of the first generation who's just growing up with pretty much everybody has one or more devices that they're accessing. So there's a whole new category of things that I think actually should be matters of public concern that just we haven't dug in on yet.
I think you can find a balance of efficiencies if you say, instead of having 9 joint committees on discrete tasks, you have a governance and policy joint committee, which would be this. You would have an operations committee, and you would have either a personnel committee and possibly a curriculum committee, but that might be best served for the 3 boards individually still.
Right. Yeah, I like that, and would say that, I mean, it's obviously a major change that goes outside of policy, but
to the extent that we believe that committees should be doing the lift and making recommendations, that ties into that in a way that is more specific than we sort of have in the structure that we have. And there was a comment in a joint committee meeting earlier this week of, well, I'm going to hold off on giving my feedback on this until we're all sitting as a joint board. And that sort of runs counter to the concept of let's do the work in committee so that we have a single voice and recommendation.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the sample language for this one, and, you know, I don't know that we're bottoming out on some of these issues and questions, but contracts binding all 3 boards should be adopted or canceled jointly. I think we agree with that. I think we're just questioning which contract specifically are we talking about?
Major contracts to be defined later. Major contracts as defined by the non-existent operations committee.
Okay. Selection of a joint committee chair. That's done by the joint committee, right?
I think you say that that's done by the joint committee biennially. If you're saying that the committees are reformed biennially in the first meeting after the elections, then in the first meeting of the joint committee, the committee selects its chair.
What are we saying? Chairs of joint committees.
Selected by the committees biennially after they are recharged.
By E? I don't
2
know about
ends.
that.
Yeah.
Okay. Still doesn't look right, but okay. Biennially.
2 L's, I think, too.
Okay. Well, now you're just making things up. Are there 2 I's?
Only on
There
your
are
face.
always
Jen.
more than two Ys, let me tell you.
There's a joint committees will be selected by the committees biennially. I can say it too. You said something about recharging, but that's also
That's
a
the
new
next
thing,
one
right?
anyway. Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
I would say that the joint committees are recharged biennially in the January meeting following the municipal elections.
Okay. Before we continue, Stephanie, do you have any administrative updates that we need to get to today?
There's nothing urgent. I sent you all some information that of course we have plenty of time to discuss, and that has to do with our policy related to vaccinations. As Chris reminded us, it doesn't go into effect until the 22-23 school year, if that remains the timing. I will say that our school leaders have received many requests to re-enroll students to be grandfathered into the religious exemption. So it's just a policy to keep on our radar for the future.
Does that grandfathering, if it's not taking effect until 22-23, does the grandfathering extend essentially to next year?
I would think so.
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
it does. So, but the students have to be currently enrolled with all of the paperwork
Right.
up to date. So there was a little bit of a rush
Right.
earlier in the week.
Can you
Okay.
explain to me what the grandfathering means, Stephanie? Because I'm a
So,
little confused.
Currently, parents can request a religious exemption and not provide vaccination information on their child, and the student can still be enrolled in our schools.
Mm.
And that expired this week, with my understanding, and someone else might correct me here, with the governor signing the bill. So
Okay.
we did have a number of parents who had possibly withdrawn their child for this school year. So they weren't currently enrolled, and they also fell under that religious exemption. So in some cases, requesting to re-enroll the student so that they would still qualify
I get it.
for the religious exemption and have it run forward.
It could
As a
also.
si- Go
So
ahead.
go ahead. Well, I was
As
just
a
going to say,
side
it could also be a function of the student is currently too young to be enrolled in kindergarten, and a parent might be trying to get that student enrolled sort of early, which would require board action, I believe.
Right. So they have to be age appropriate, but certainly we're accepting registration. So if the parent was sort of holding off on making that decision for lots of
Right.
other reasons,
Right.
and now there was another reason that would prompt, I want to register them immediately.
Mhm.
Would
So-
enrollment in our preschool count for the grandfathering? Is it only enrollment in the K-8 system?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'd have to check.
And are we allowed to report on the total number of students who claim this exemption? Do we know that?
We have to report.
Okay.
In fact, the state keeps stats on this.
And they started publishing it too.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Which has
feel
led
that
to a
there was
lot of
couple years ago when
frustration.
they published it for the first time, and
Yeah. I remember there was an article last year or something that
Yeah.
seemed like
There were
trying
data
to.
errors at RES that led
Yeah.
to brief panic that something like only 80% were vaccinated or something. like
Right.
that.
right,
Okay.
which was a data error.
All right.
I hope
Um,
this law goes through.
It's
People
done.
can send
Good
their
sign.
kid
It did. It did.
Send your kid to a pro measles private school if that's what you want.
Pro
You know, I
measles.
just no.
I mean, believe in science. Like, let's start there. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Go live on your compound.
okay. So we went to administrative updates. I think we probably want to stop there. I just want to do a quick look.
I think we can hit 10 and 11 real fast.
Okay, let's go for it.
10 is just the individual board chairs have discretion to add and remove members, but they will be formal reappointments every other January. So committee members shall be reappointed in the January following the same meeting as the charges.
Or as needed by board chairs.
Right. Yeah.
As determined.
Right. Or as otherwise in the discretion of the board chair. Yeah. Because there will be turnover in board members in between those meetings and other things too. And then 11 is just on or before January 31st of each year, the committee shall publish a regular meeting schedule. Or whatever the statute is, I think that's what it is.
I think you can publish before the end of the year, but you can correct, make adjustments before January 31st.
Maybe, I mean, you can say on it before December 31st, the committees will publish a regular meeting schedule for the following year, just to.
Huh? Appraisal of the work underway.
I don't know what that is, so I'm happy to stop there.
I think this is individual board members or individual committee members will report back to their boards.
Yeah,
to provide
to
status.
apprise them of, yeah.
Not appraisal, appraisal.
Yeah.
Or-
Yeah. Fine. Okay. All right. So we'll stop there. Good progress. Moving along. It's going to take us to public comment. No members of the public being present. Committee member comment.
Good to be back.
We missed you. Glad you're back.
Welcome. All right. And do I hear a motion to adjourn?
You do.
Thank you, Chris. Seconded by Gwen. All in favor?
Aye.
Very good. We are adjourned at 9:57 a.m.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Take care.